The grand ballroom of the high-end restaurant shimmered under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers. The air was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of fine china, and the occasional burst of laughter from wealthy guests seated at their elegantly adorned tables. It was an evening of luxury, where the elite gathered to indulge in the finest cuisine, sip on vintage wine, and bask in their own importance. At one of the most prominent tables, a woman sat surrounded by her friends, her presence impossible to ignore. Veronica Langley, a name that carried weight in high society, was dressed in an elegant gown that likely cost more than what some people made in a year. Her jewelry sparkled, her manicured fingers drumming lightly against the table. As she enjoyed the admiration of those around her, she thrived in this world, where wealth determined status and power dictated respect. As she leaned in to whisper something to her friends, her sharp blue eyes suddenly caught sight of a young man approaching their table. He wore a crisp white shirt, a black vest neatly buttoned over it, and a name tag pinned just above his heart. His posture was upright, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, an unshaken confidence that most would overlook. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice polite and measured. "Are you ready to place your order?" Veronica barely glanced at the menu before waving her hand dismissively. "Just bring me the lobster bisque and the filet mignon," she said, then smirked as she turned to her friends. "Though I suppose you wouldn't know much about fine dining, would you?" The group chuckled, and one of her friends leaned forward with a grin. "I doubt he even knows what half the dishes on this menu are," she said in a voice dripping with condescension. The waiter, whose name tag read Malik, remained composed, though a flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark brown eyes. He had heard comments like this before. He had seen the way people like Veronica looked at him, as if his existence was beneath them, as if he was invisible unless he was serving them. But he refused to let their words shake him. "Of course, ma'am," Malik responded simply, taking down the orders without missing a beat. But Veronica was not done. Something about his unwavering presence, the way he did not shrink under her gaze, irritated her. She thrived on power, on making people feel small, and she was determined to remind this waiter of his place. "Tell me, Malik," she said, emphasizing his name with a slow, deliberate tone. "How does someone like you end up in a place like this?" The room grew slightly quieter as her words hung in the air. Some nearby guests glanced over, sensing the shift in tone. But Malik did not falter. He simply gave a small, knowing smile. "Hard work, ma'am," he said. "Just like anything worth having." Veronica scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Hard work," she repeated, laughing. "Please, you serve tables while people like us own them." She shook her head as if the thought amused her. "You might as well get used to it. Some people are just meant to be in the background." Her friends erupted into laughter, some nodding in agreement. But as Malik collected their menus and turned to leave, something unexpected happened. A soft melody drifted through the air. Gentle, at first, then growing stronger. It was coming from a nearby stage, where the restaurant often had live performances, and the moment the voice filled the room, conversations paused. Utensils stopped clinking. Even the staff momentarily froze in place. The voice was rich, smooth, carrying an undeniable power that sent a ripple through the audience. The depth of emotion in the melody was impossible to ignore. It was the kind of voice that commanded attention without asking for it. And as the song continued, people turned toward the stage, curiosity flashing in their eyes. Veronica's smile faded as her gaze followed theirs. Her fingers tightened around her glass of wine, confusion flickering across her face, because standing under the spotlight, microphone in hand, was none other than Malik. The same waiter she had just belittled now held the room captive with nothing but his voice. The same man she had dismissed as insignificant was now making heads turn, drawing admiration from the very people she sought to impress. And for the first time that evening, Veronica felt something she had not expected: unease. She had laughed at him moments ago, but now, it felt like the entire world was laughing at her. The moment Malik's voice filled the room, it was as if time had stopped. The melody wrapped itself around the listeners, pulling them in, making them feel something deeper than just the words of the song. It was raw, soulful, the kind of sound that settled into people's bones and refused to leave. Even those who had barely glanced at the stage before were now leaning forward, their eyes locked on the young man standing under the spotlight. Veronica's fingers twitched against the stem of her glass. Her jaw tightened. She could not understand it. Just moments ago, he had been nothing more than a waiter, just another background figure in the world she ruled. And yet, here he was, commanding attention in a way she never could. The people who had been laughing along with her were now silent, completely enraptured. Even her own friends were staring at Malik with something close to awe. She set her glass down harder than necessary, the soft clink of crystal on marble barely audible over the song. "I do not see what is so special about this," she muttered, though no one was paying attention to her anymore. Malik's voice soared, carrying the weight of something deeper, something that was not just talent, but lived experience. Every note, every lyric seemed to hold a story, and it was clear that he was not just performing. He was feeling every word. A man at a nearby table turned to his wife. "Incredible," he murmured. "Where did they find him?" "I have no idea," she whispered back, shaking her head. "But I have never heard anything like this before." And neither had Veronica. She knew talent when she saw it. She had spent years surrounding herself with the best designers, best chefs, best musicians at her lavish parties. But this was different. This was not rehearsed elegance or polished performance. This was real, untouched, something no amount of money could buy. And it unsettled her. The song built to a climax, Malik's voice rising with an effortless power that sent chills through the room. And then, just as smoothly, he brought it back down, ending on a note so soft, yet so full of meaning that it left behind a heavy silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the first clap broke through, hesitant at first, as if people needed a second to process what they had just witnessed. But soon, the applause grew, rolling through the room like a wave. Some guests even stood up, their faces filled with admiration. Malik gave a small nod, a quiet smile playing on his lips, before stepping back from the microphone. Veronica's nails dug into the tablecloth. She could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She had mocked him, dismissed him as nothing more than a servant in her world. But now, the way people were looking at him, it was the way she was used to being looked at. And she hated it. One of her friends, a woman named Olivia, turned toward her with wide eyes. "Veronica," she breathed. "Do you know who he is?" Veronica scoffed, forcing out a dry laugh. "Of course not. He is just a waiter." Olivia shook her head, her perfectly styled curls bouncing with the movement. "No, that voice, it is not normal. He is somebody." Another friend, Daniel, leaned in. "I think I have seen him before," he said, frowning as if trying to place a memory. "He looks familiar." The curiosity in their voices made Veronica's stomach twist. They were interested. They were impressed. And it made her feel something she was not used to feeling. Irrelevant. Across the room, the restaurant manager, a tall man with sharp features, approached Malik and clapped him on the shoulder. "You never told me you could do that," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "You just made this restaurant 10 times more valuable." Malik chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just something I have always done," he said simply. But it was clear to everyone now. This was not just something. Veronica's mind raced. She needed to know more. Who was he? How had someone like him, a waiter, managed to captivate an entire room of people who normally would not give him a second glance? She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Malik as he returned to his work. collecting empty plates as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And for the first time in a long time, Veronica Langley felt something she never thought she would feel towards someone like him. Uncertainty. Veronica could not stop thinking about it. Even after Malik had returned to his duties, blending back into the background like every other waiter, his voice still lingered in the air. It was as if the song had left an imprint on the room, on the people inside it. Conversations had resumed, but the energy had shifted. People who had ignored him moments before were now stealing glances in his direction. Even the chef had stepped out from the kitchen to shake his hand. Veronica hated that. She sipped her wine, barely tasting it, her mind racing. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why? Why? Did it bother her so much that he had stolen the attention so effortlessly? Her friends were still talking about him. Olivia was scrolling through her phone, muttering something about how she was sure she had seen him before. Daniel had leaned over to ask a waiter if Malik had ever performed professionally. Even the older couple at the next table seemed curious, whispering in hushed voices. Veronica had always believed in one thing. People were born into their places in life. The wealthy, the powerful, they were meant to shine. And people like Malik, they were meant to serve. They were meant to stay in the background, invisible, unnoticed. But now, all eyes were on him. A slow burn of resentment curled in her chest. She had worked for years to cultivate her place in high society, to ensure that she was the one people talked about. And yet, a waiter, had stolen the moment without even trying. She set her glass down. "It was not that impressive," she said, a little too sharply. "I have heard better." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" Veronica forced a smile. "Of course. I attend exclusive events all the time. I have connections in the music industry. Trust me, he is nothing special." But even as she said it, she could feel the lie. Across the room, Malik continued clearing tables, his expression calm, as if he had not just stunned an entire room full of people. The ease with which he carried himself irritated Veronica even more. He did not even seem aware of the effect he had. Or worse, maybe he was aware and simply did not care. And that was unacceptable. Veronica did not lose. She did not get overshadowed. A plan began to form in her mind. If Malik thought he could impress people and climb his way out of the life he was meant to live, she would remind him exactly where he stood. As the night went on, Veronica made sure to keep her voice loud whenever she spoke, drawing attention back to herself. She dropped names of influential people she had met, casually bragged about the private parties she had been invited to, and even went as far as mentioning a famous singer she had once dined with. She needed to re-establish the balance, to remind everyone in the room that she was the one worth paying attention to. And yet, no matter how much she talked, the shift had already happened. People nodded, smiled politely, but the spark of interest she was used to seeing in their eyes was dim. They were still thinking about him. The realization made her grip her napkin a little too tightly. She needed more. Words would not be enough. Veronica was used to getting what she wanted. And right now, what she wanted was for Malik to fade back into the shadows where he belonged. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As the restaurant began winding down for the night, Malik passed by her table, balancing a tray of empty glasses. Veronica leaned back in her chair, watching him with a calculating gaze. "Malik," she said smoothly. He paused, glancing at her. "Ma'am." She smiled, the kind of smile that had won her favors and deals in the past. "You never mentioned you could sing." Malik's expression did not change. "It is not something I bring up." "Oh, but why not?" she pressed, tilting her head. "You clearly have talent. Though..." She let her eyes drift over him, her tone turning just a touch condescending. "It must be difficult, working here when you could be doing something Else. Malik remained silent for a moment, then gave a small shrug. Work is work. She laughed, though there was little humor in it. Come now, do not be so humble. Surely you have dreams of something bigger. Malik met her gaze evenly. Dreams do not pay bills, ma'am. Veronica's smile tightened. She had expected him to be flattered, to bask in the attention, maybe even try to impress her. But instead, he remained unreadable, unmoved. That only made her more determined. Well, she said, taking a sip of her wine, if you ever do decide to pursue music, you should let me know. I have connections. I know people who could help you. She let the words sit for a moment before adding, of course, opportunities like that do not come often, and they are not for everyone. For the first time, something flickered in Malik's eyes. Amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell, but his expression remained composed as he said, I appreciate the offer, ma'am. Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Veronica's fingers curled around the stem of her glass. She was not used to being ignored, and she was not done yet.